Did someone climb Mid-Everest before? Let's find out the truth behind this mystery. Before the first ascent of Everest on May 29, 1953, there had been 14 or maybe 15 attempts to ascend the highest peak in the world. The best known is the 1924 attempt when Andrew Irvine and George Mallory disappeared. But the climbing stories of the other attempts are very interesting too, with lots of exciting micro-stories within each climb. At the end of the 19th century, British organizations like the Royal Geographical Society, RGS, and the Alpine Club had been working out how to send a scouting expedition to Everest. Among those who most promoted the idea were Sir Francis Younghusband and Charles Bruce. However, the British had trouble obtaining permission because of complicated political and diplomatic reasons. British Army officer John Noel illegally entered Tibet in 1913, but only made it within 70 kilometers of Everest. In 1919, explorer Charles Howard Barry addressed a letter to the RGS, suggesting a reconnaissance expedition. Howard Barry intended to reach Everest's summit, but the Indian office rejected his proposal. In 1920, Howard Barry visited India and entered Tibet, where he met British political officer Charles Bell. Bell had good contacts in Tibet and visited the Dalai Lama later in 1920. After their discussion, the Dalai Lama promised to grant permission for the British to send an expedition to Everest. The RGS and the Alpine Club established the Everest Committee with Younghusband as chairperson. A reconnaissance expedition to Everest started to form. Although the main objective was reconnaissance, it didn't mean that a climb couldn't take place. In 1921, a reconnaissance expedition was finally launched under the leadership of Howard Barry. The team consisted of 8 British men, 1 Canadian, and a group of porters. Among the team members were George Mallory and Alexander Kellis. The group approached Everest via Sikkim Chumbi Valley, entering Tibet. British mountaineer, chemist, and explorer Alexander Kellis had been investigating high-altitude physiology to see whether the human body could adapt to high altitudes. With great prescience, he concluded that in the future, it would be possible to climb Everest without bottled oxygen. However, Kellis advocated for the team to use oxygen. Kellis never made it to Everest. During the approach trek, he died of a heart attack in the village of Kampadzong. He could be considered Everest's first climbing fatality. Later, an Indian porter also died during the approach. The team explored the west, north, and east sides of Everest during an expedition that lasted 96 days. 2 of the climbers, Guy Bullock and George Mallory, reached the North Pole at 7,020 meters without bottled oxygen. Some strange footprints were detected at high altitudes. Howard Barry suggested that they might be from a large gray wolf, but the Sherpas insisted that the footprints were from a Mech Kangmi, filthy snowman. Likely the result of a later mistranslation, the expression became the abominable snowman. The British went to Everest again in the spring of 1922, led by Brigadier General Charles Bruce. Bruce was a former boxer and had also represented England years before in an international running competition. He had broad experience in the highest mountains of Asia, too. Before 1922, Bruce had been on expeditions to the Karakoram, Nanga Parbat, and Trisul. A member of the Indian Army, Bruce was fluent in the Nepali language. He introduced his Gurkhas to hill racing, and he took the best of them to Zermatt in the Alps to learn ice climbing. Bruce's 1922 team included Tom Longstaff, Edward Norton, Howard Somervell, and George Mallory. The group made an attempt from the Tibetan side of Everest. Bruce and Australian George Ingle Finch reached 8,326 meters with bottled oxygen. But exhausted, they could not progress further because of problems with their O2 cylinders. Far worse, an avalanche killed 7 Sherpas below the North Pole. The best-known attempt was in the spring of 1924. There is a lot of literature written on this expedition. The British team, under the leadership of Edward Norton, tried to ascend from the north. The route they chose had been suggested by Mallory in 1921. Rongbuk Glacier, North Col North, Ridge Northeast Ridge Summit. In small groups, they made 3 attempts. The first 2 went without bottled oxygen. The first attempt, made by George Mallory and Jeffrey Bruce, couldn't reach Camp 6 at 8,200 meters. Edward Norton and Howard Somervell made the second attempt. After Somervell retreated, Norton made it higher than anyone before him, reaching an astonishing 8,573 meters without bottled oxygen. The third attempt was carried out by George Mallory and Andrew Irvine with bottled oxygen. The pair was last seen at about 8 to 600 miles on the northeast ridge before they disappeared. Mallory's body was found in May 1999 at 8,155 meters. Some people think that they summited Everest, but this is unconfirmed. Their camera has never been found. Hugh Rutledge led a team featuring British and Indian climbers, as well as a group of Sherpas, to the north side of Everest in the spring of 1933. The group reached 8,570 meters without supplementary oxygen before they retreated because of the difficulty of the route. Maurice Wilson, in 1934, was a God-fearing man. Maurice Wilson was full of self-confidence, but had very little climbing experience. With rubbish equipment, he tried to climb Everest alone from the north. At the start of his expedition, he was accompanied by 2 Sherpas, but they later left. The Sherpas correctly observed that Wilson's idea was too ambitious and dangerous, but Wilson continued, believing faith alone would help him reach the summit. Wilson died at 6,500 meters of exposure. His body was found 1 year later. In his diary, found beside his body, the last entry was, "Off again. Gorgeous day." Eric Shipton's 1935 attempt, renowned alpinist and explorer Eric Shipton led a team to the north side of Everest in the summer of 1935. Among the team members were Harold William Tillman and Tenzing Norgay. Bad conditions made them retreat from around 7,000 meters on the north side without supplementary oxygen. They also made a reconnaissance of the west side of Everest. In the spring of 1936, Hugh Rutledge returned to Everest and reached 7,000 meters without bottled oxygen. Bad weather meant the team did not continue higher. In 1938, Bill Tillman's team reached 8,300 meters on O2, where they had to give up because of deep snow. In 1947, Canadian engineer Earl Denman, together with Tenzing Norgay and Angdawa Sherpa, entered Tibet illegally to attempt to Everest from the north. A strong storm hit, and they only reached 6,700 meters, but they descended safely. Norgay knew that Denman had very little chance of succeeding and admitted that the pull of Everest was stronger for me than any force on Earth. In 1950, China occupied Tibet, and access to Everest from that side was forbidden for Western teams. In 1950, Bill Tillman returned with a few partners and made an exploratory expedition to Everest through Nepal. Their approach route is now the normal approach route to the mountain. In 1951, Klavs Becker Larsen led a Danish team to Everest. They first entered Nepal and crossed to the northern, Tibetan side through Lola Pass. They climbed without bottled O2, but at 6,800 meters, they abandoned the climb because of rockfall. They had poor mountain equipment and very little mountaineering experience, yet they were the first Europeans to reach Nangpa La. In the autumn of 1951, Eric Shipton's team approached Everest from Nepal's Khumbu Valley and reached 6,000 meters without bottled O2. In 1952, there were 2 Swiss expeditions. The first team, led by Edouard West Dunant, ascended the southeast ridge, today's normal route, in spring to 8,600. They climbed with supplementary oxygen, but ran out of energy and couldn't make the summit. That autumn, the second Swiss team arrived. Led by Gabriel Chevalier, they made another O2 attempt on the southeast ridge, reaching 8,100 meters. Bad weather forced them down. During the expedition, an ice avalanche killed 1 Sherpa, and 2 porters died on the approach march. It was rumored that in the autumn of 1952, an expedition led by Pavel Dachnolian from the former Soviet Union attempted to reach Everest from the north. Dachnolian wanted to beat the British to the top. Supposedly, the expedition reached 8,200 meters, but Dachnolian and 5 other team members died of unknown causes. However, both Russian and Chinese authorities denied that the expedition had taken place.